There's an old morbid joke in medicine. Operation was successful, patient died. It's evidence of exactly the kind of medicine I don't practice. Medicine that's technically brilliant, but spiritually bankrupt. The survival and flourishing of the person asleep on that operating table is the whole point of the practice of medicine. There's no success in medicine without some contribution to that survival and flourishing. Even at the end of our life, our success is measured by whether we relieve suffering, achieve closure, and foster peace of mind. Saving a life or comforting the dying and the bereft are among the greatest mitzvot, the highest religious obligations on the Jewish to-do list. So what happens when other items on that list of obligations come into conflict with a person's health or with their mental stability? Observing dietary laws, fasting on prescribed days, and keeping a Sabbath are tremendously important in Jewish practice, and in many other religions as well. For some people, they come at a steep price. Navigating that requires not just knowing the letter of the law, but having a delicate sensitivity to the person facing the dilemma and their individual needs. Today, I'm joined by my lifelong friend, Rabbanit Miriam Fenster, for a discussion of the Halacha, literally the way we walk, of living with religious obligation and illness, mental or physical, at the same time. I think you'll find her approach creative, caring, and instructive for both those who are looking to practice their religion authentically and those who are looking to practice better medicine. Stay tuned.
No room for the soul that's in my head. No room for the soul that's in my heart.
When someone's sick, they're not just dealing with annoying symptoms. They're confronting some of life's biggest questions. I'm Dr. Jonathan Winkle, and you're listening to Healing People, Not Patients. Join us as we explore how to make our practice about complete healing of the body and the spirit. Welcome back, everyone. I am super glad to be back from my little hiatus. I'm even more glad to welcome my dear friend, Rabbanit Miriam Fenster. We have been friends for a number of decades, and we go way back to our high school days in the Yada youth movement and in the beautiful village of Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I will say lots of glowing things about Miriam's brother, Dan, and about her parents, Walter and Eva Vogel. But we'll get to them in the course of our conversation. What's important for all of you to know about Miriam is that she has long been a student at Matan HaSharon in Ra'anana, Israel, in the Advanced Halacha program for women. She advises people ages 15 to 85 on matters of family life, life cycle, Shabbat, laws of kosher, and in particular is now working with a program called Maaglei Nefesh, which is specifically geared towards advising people who are grappling with different types of mental illness and how that affects their ability to observe Jewishly in their day-to-day lives. We've had a really fascinating conversation about this already for a lecture series that I helped to coordinate at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm really glad to be able to have a free-form give and take with Miriam today on the podcast. I was also asked to mention that she has many lovely grandchildren who find her very boring unless she is either singing the Grand Old Duke of York or reading Yertle the Turtle. But I think she's fascinating all the time. Miriam, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for asking me. I'm really excited just to schmooze and riff with you on all of this.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start with kind of a basic question. One of our many links is your parents' Passover Seder table. And I always do this in the form of 4 questions. And basically the theme is the same as it is at the Seder. Why is this thing that you do different from all other things of its nature? How does it make people's lives different? And in particular, we're at kind of the intersection between religious practice and health and wellness. Normally, I'm coming at it from the other direction where how does bringing religion, spirituality, theology, whatever into the conversation help or in some way affect somebody's ability to be well, stay well, get better from an illness? Here we're looking at it the other way around. We're talking about places where religious observance becomes difficult because of somebody's mental or physical condition. And I think when a lot of people hear that, they think, oh, we're talking about ways to get out of fulfilling an obligation that you're normally committed to when you're healthy, based on the fact that you're not healthy right now. But that's not how you frame it at all. So I'd love you to explain how your process works.
Okay. Can I start with a story? Is that okay?
Please. I love starting with stories.
Okay. So a la my parents, whom you knew and loved very well, and my brother, whom you still, for some reason I will never understand, still hang out with, even though he's my favorite baby brother of all time. It's also my only baby brother. So when our father died in 2001 and we were sitting Shiva, lots of people came in and they all said a very similar statement to my brother and my mother, and it tremendously comforted them and it made me miserable. The statement was that your father went through such horrible suffering and now he's sitting at the feet of Kisei Kavod, right? You know, he's up there in Gan Eden. And it really helped Daniel. It really helped Mommy. It didn't speak to me at all. And by the time I flew back from the United States to Israel, you know, I was like, what's wrong with me? What is wrong with me that here's a statement that is not said in a way to hurt, but it's said to help, right? And what's wrong with me that I can't deal with it? And then what happened was I wound up going to speak to somebody who was very, very close with my father, Rabbi Zuckerman. And I just sat there and I cried. And I said, what's wrong with me? And he said, there's nothing that's wrong with you. He said, you just needed to hear something different. Now, anybody could have told me that, right? Anybody could have told me about that. But the fact that it was a Rab, okay, who knew my father, who knew our family, and he said, you just needed to hear something different. And he gave me something different, which really helped. You could say that that's part of what, in some place, is always in the back of my head. When you ask how I frame it, right? There's no one good answer. There's no one right answer. You asked me how I frame it. So I'm going to say there's a general framing and then there's a specific framing for the person. The general frame, and it's something I really believe in, is you have the 4 amot of Jewish law, right? The Dalet amot of Halacha that you have to, like fence posts, right? That you can't go past them. But inside that space is infinitely flexible. That the baseline frame is always that it's not a question of getting out of, it's a question of where do you see yourself?
Let me reflect back to you to make sure I'm understanding. So you're saying that there is a kind of a baseline of obligations that people have. There's a standard way of shaping it, but within that standard way of shaping it, each individual has their own path of how to get there based on certain kind of needs. And those paths mostly overlap. But every once in a while, they have to diverge in a particular way because of something compelling for that person.
Yes, that's definitely one way of that. Yeah. But I would say even more than that. With Jewish law, you can look at it in a very, very rigid way, right? Like everything has to fit. But the thing is, it's not rigid at all. It's very fluid. And there's a very big difference between what you read in a book and when you turn to someone personally, because by definition, books are giving you a bottom line on general situations. But every single human being has their own story, right? Every single human being, it's not just what they're going through. It's also where they're coming from, where they physically are, where they emotionally are, who's dependent on them, who they are dependent on. And all of those aspects have an influence on the halachic answer that you give. And I guess you could say that that's why I'm saying that one of the things that's so important that I frame is that enormous horizon that they exist in, that it's not this linear, static box, right?
Mhm.
But the other thing, and I'm trying to think of the right way to say, is that it's very important to me. And again, this depends on the person, but in general, it's important to me that that person, they set the tone.
So you told the story about your father's Shiva, which so I do have some non-Jewish listeners. So this is the 7-day mourning period after someone's funeral, which is a time of folks visiting and offering condolences. But I was always taught that during a Shiva, the mourner speaks first.
Yes.
Exactly for the reason you're talking about, so that they can set the tone of what they need to hear, rather than somebody coming in and offering sort of, there's one prescribed phrase that you say, "Hamakom Yenachem Sha'arei Le'Tzion V'Yerushalayim," the ever-present one comfort you among all the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. But that's it. That's a formula. Doesn't say how you should be comforted. Certainly doesn't say that you should come with your own pre-planned speech to comfort that person, because you don't know, like you said, what they need to hear. The other thing, of course, is that you keep on using that word, and I know it means exactly what you think it means, but right, for the folks in the background, the idea of haha, which is from the word to go, right? It's the way you go about things in the world, rather than from the word chuk, which is law, is, sort of fixed,
Exactly.
unquestionable law. So it's a process. And I think a lot of people, whether it's in the more liberal Jewish world or whether in the non-Jewish world, Halacha will often get characterized exactly as you said, as this very rigid, very stringent body of rules, doesn't change, and that sort of ropes people into very uncomfortable, restrictive situations. And you're giving a much more alive and vibrant picture of it, which I agree with you, is a more accurate picture. I think it's breaking some myths for folks.
I think, well, I blame poorly administered or poorly taught or poorly whatever education, which makes this a very common misconception among everybody, because it's very easy to start with a do and a don't, because there's so many do's and don'ts. But I think also because of the fact that in general, children are taught that things are black and white. As you get older, more gray is introduced into your life by definition, but nobody updates you that that's also the way the compendium of Jewish law works.
Yeah.
That it also starts going gray, as in you're never going to find any rabbi who's going to say, "Oh, sure, you can bake challah for the Seder night."
Yep.
No rabbi is going to say that. Doesn't matter what denomination. They are not going to tell you that you can bake challah for the Seder night, because challah is yeasted bread as opposed to unleavened bread. But what happens if you have celiac? What happens if you are on a very, very restricted diet, and one of the things you have to eat involves nutritious yeast, right? Right.
Right.
And then they're all going to say, well, we were talking about this, but you are a different case. And now we need to look at your case. And I blame education for never helping people get over that hurdle.
One of my favorite light bulb moments around that, which just to illustrate, we're talking about this, that has nothing to do with medicine. The first time somebody gave me a kosher for Passover bottle of date ale, and I turn it around, the ingredients are water, date syrup, and yeast. And I was like, what? And I realized that the thing that you're not allowed to eat on Passover is the combination of grain flour and yeast. If you combine something else like fruit with yeast, that's not hummus. And so you're put in a different category. And so people who, because of their particular health status, in a different category moment, their situation is different. I'm remembering, going back to the story of the Shiva, right? Text that's always taught about is from the book of Job, where they come in and they observe the law for the first 7 days. His friends come in and they sit on the floor and they say nothing, and he says nothing, and they're waiting for him to talk. finally the Shiva is over and they're still there and they can't keep their mouths shut any longer and they start to talk and they say all the wrong things.
But I one time was in a truly tremendous lecture given by one of my favorite teachers where he actually said, if you look at what all of the friends say, they give all of the stock answers that are given throughout the Bible. But what Eov is always saying to them is, yeah, but that doesn't work when you're talking about me. And he actually said, none of these answers can explain why 2 million children died in the Holocaust. That was his go-to thing, where he took every single answer and he said, it works fine with all of these, and now apply it to 2 million children dying in the Holocaust. So there's no answer in the world that you can give. Anyway, I think that it's really, really good what you said about trajectory or line. And I'm going to go back to my father's Shiva, and I will tell you what Rav Zuckerman said, which helped, because this actually fits in really well. Okay. He said, you don't think about a person being alive and a person being dead as linear, as in they're alive and then they're dead. Okay. He said, all of us, we are a mixture of body and soul, right? So we have a spiritual side and a physical side. What happens when our physical side dies? He said you have to think about it as two different tracks. That there's the track that humanity is on, where we live and breathe and eat and sleep and work and everything in this world. And the spiritual track, which doesn't have that body element. He said they run side by side. Now, I know that sounds like a weird thing, but the reason why sometimes you might feel that your father is right there is because on a certain level, he always is. Just you can't feel him because you still have a physical manifestation. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because it's not that all of a sudden they're in a different group inside the same body, right? You have different tracks, and sometimes you're on one of them and sometimes you're on another one, but they are all in the same starting point and the same ending point. That's why I said it's a good analogy, and that's why I want to use it, because I think one of the worst things that happens, and it's something that I get a lot, is no, you're not cheating. You're not pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. You know, frequently when I say, no, yes, you can do this, but that's cheating.
Right. Which is the mentality that I was thinking of when I asked the question originally.
And then you're saying, no, it's not cheating. Explaining to people that all of these laws, which they have been taught their entire lives, are immutable, that they all have, for lack of a better word, side doors built in, right? Where if you need to use them, you can. And that those side doors were always constructed into it. It's not that somebody just decided to knock a hole in the wall, right? Those doors were always in there. Like, you know, like going through all the tunnels in Pittsburgh. I remember as a little kid being fascinated with all those doors. I was like, right? All those doors in the tunnels, right? I remember once, like, what are the doors for? I always had this image that if mommy and daddy dropped me off on one of the Liberty tubes, if I opened the door, if I could walk through and wind up in the other one. But like, that's a very difficult concept for people to understand, that it's not cheating and that you're there. You're just on a different track.
Right. You told me a bunch of stories as we were getting ready for the first talk about people who are on some of those different tracks.
Okay. So I work on a hotline, right? So you can chat or you can Zoom call, or it can be a telephone call. So it happened that I was on a chat with a young woman who's in a mental hospital. And she said that she wanted to know if she would be allowed to paint on Shabbat, which is one of the things which you are prohibited from doing, which is painting, drawing, writing, because she was hospitalized because she tried to kill herself. And she said, I still don't feel stable. Can I do that? Now, she contacted a hotline, right? Which tells you already several things. One of them is that she could very easily just decided on her own, right? And she's in a mental hospital. So to make a point to call a hotline about something like this tells you that this is a very, very, very important issue for her, that she's really at odds with. This calms me down, but, but Shabbat is so important to me. What do I do? So basically the entire text chat was, okay, this is an enormous no. Obviously. And so then the question was, is this part of your therapy? Because if it was part of her therapy, so then you can say there's a place to say that if she is right now in a closed ward and in a very dangerous situation, then you say, okay, that the saving of a life supersedes everything. Okay. That wasn't her situation. But again, the point wasn't telling her it's a big no. The point was like, let's see if there's something else that can help you. So ultimately, she said, listening to music really calms me down. Wonderful. Amazing, right? We're talking about a completely different level, right? So I said, more than writing, more than painting, because it's important to me that she also know that I'm not just saying, oh, well, this one's right. She says, I don't know, but I think it would really help. And I want to give it a try. So again, it's important that she have the agency. She says, I want to give it a try. This is a person who's lost so much of their agency. For them to say, I think I want to do this. I said, okay. So then listen, you set up your cell phone to play music and you listen to it whenever you need. You don't have to worry about it because it's a totally different level. And then I said, and if it works, I'm very happy. If it doesn't help, you do what you need to do in order to calm yourself down, and contact me next week and we'll see what we can do instead.
So then you're not making a blanket pronouncement. It's basically what in my line of work, we would call a trial of therapy, right? You're like, you don't just say, well, I'm going to prescribe you this medicine and this is supposed to work and keep taking it forever. He's like, I'm going to prescribe you this for a week. And if the side effects are terrible, we'll have to try something different. Or if it's not good enough, we'll have to increase the dose. I love that.
Okay. And so she answered with, I actually feel really positive about this. If I don't contact you next week, it's because it worked. That was how she ended it. Now, I like to think that's why there's no way of knowing because, when they contact you on the hotline, you are not supposed to contact. There's all sorts of rules we have to follow. But that's one story there. But then you also have people like there was a woman on the 2 hours before Yom Kippur starts. We get the woman we get a note on the WhatsApp group that all of the people on the hotline work on. We get an alert saying somebody called. She needs somebody to speak to her right now. Okay. I spoke to her. She said, I have to eat. I said, okay, explain. I tried. I've this, I've that. Basically what she wanted was she wanted me to tell her, it's okay. No problem. You can eat as much as you want, however much. And all she could say was just thinking about fasting makes me ill. I have to eat. I have to eat. I have to eat. Please tell me that I can eat as much as I want or as much as I need. At this point, I went, this is way above my pay grade. And I said to her, I need to get back to you. And you know this as a doctor, what happens when something goes above your pay grade? You go to the person who knows way more than you, right?
You call a consult. Yes.
Exactly.
So you call a consult.
So I called a consult with my boss this is something that he deals with regularly. And I said, what do I do? And he said something to me, which I thought was, first of all, he says, when he gets questions like that, and he says he gets them, he never tells them yes, and he never tells them no. When he gets somebody who is convinced and they're not able to give you information, I absolutely have to. Where are you at home? When they're not, for whatever reason, able to give you more information, he tells them every person knows their own self better than anybody else does. And that this is between them and God. And you basically say to them, listen, you know what you're allowed to do. You know what you're not allowed to do. You know that eating in those prescribed amounts is okay. And beyond that is your call. He never gives a straight answer. He doesn't do it because he doesn't want to be responsible. The way he phrased it was that, and if you tell them that they can eat, that might be the worst thing for them to hear. And if you tell them that they can't eat, he said, because they are being so very murky, you have to give them an answer that is, as in saying, I know it's on that level of murkiness, but it's saying, listen, if a person says they have to eat and they absolutely have to eat, halev yodea marat nafsho, right? As in, it's the murkiness is, I'm not next to you. I can't know. This is the psak that is given, which is if somebody is completely hysterical and they have to eat or else they're going to die, as in, and I don't mean physically die. I mean, as it's that kind of psychological burden, then you're the only person who can make that call. And I am giving you leave to make that call. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So from these stories, I'm starting to get a sense of how you decide what the appropriate path is for each individual. And having already said, like, there's a different track different people need to be on. The last time we talked, you sort of laid out some guiding principles that you use to decide when you are looking for like a compromise position where they do a modified version of the usual practice, and where, you know, the sense of being obligated to do this thing is so burdensome for them that it just has to be set aside for the time. And where sometimes you say, you know what, you can do this and go ahead and do it normally. Different tracks for different people. Tell us a little bit about how you make that decision, those core principles, you know, the 4 that are really 5 that you talked to me about the last time. Whatever else you want to throw in as well.
Well, the 4 principles that are really 5 are, okay, I guess the 5th one is the one that really is the underpinnings of everything, right? Which you said is also for doctors, which is if you are not willing to assume full responsibility for whatever answer you give and say, if I made a mistake, it's on me, not on them, then you need to find another line of work. So even with that murky answer I gave her, it wasn't a question of, oh, it's not a me problem, it's a you problem. That wasn't the point of that answer. Because I'm still telling her, if you need to eat, then halev yodea marat nafsho, which means ultimately it's me who's giving that answer, right? And the know your sources and don't be afraid to say you don't know, right? Which was Mommy, the great educator, where she said the easiest way to lose the respect of your students is to pretend that you know when you don't, you know? And if you make a mistake, then you correct it, know your sources, and also the empathy. Well, part of it goes back to the Dalet Amot, the limits that I have. There are limits which constrain me. That's also something else. I guess you can say a corollary to those 5 is something that one of my teachers said, which is, if you have to have the courage to say yes, but you also can't be afraid of saying no.
Yeah.
As it, you have to be able to say, I know you think you can't, but you can. But you also have to turn around and tell that person, I'm sorry, but no. Or not even the I'm sorry. You have to be able to say no. And if you can't do those, then you need to find a different line of work. So that always has to be there in my mind, right?
Yeah.
As in, there are times where I have to tell somebody, look, within this parameter, I can't help you. But I can help you when we widen it. I think a lot of it is when you talk to the person, because there's different things. Sometimes talking to the people and asking them questions and continuing to ask them questions is so important. I would say, like what you do with your work. And because sometimes the person just needs hand-holding, right? Sometimes, like you said, the burden is just so enormous. You have to tell them right now, you're exempt from it. Right now, it's not on you. We're moving it to somebody else because it's too much for you. Other times, it's a question of redirection, right? Or redefining, as in saying, you thought that honoring and respecting your parents meant that they could verbally abuse you whenever they wanted. We are telling you that honoring and respecting your parents does not allow them to verbally abuse you at all, ever, right? You know,
Yes, for sure.
sometimes it's, again, that you're fighting against a block. I mean, like when I say fighting, in a way it sort of is. Like sometimes you spend a lot of your time convincing someone that no, they're not actually cheating anything. Like they're not pulling the wool over God's eyes. They're like, yeah, but that means I'm cheating. No, it does not mean you're cheating.
Go into that bit a little bit. You laid out very beautifully the last talk that we did together, where you talked about sort of the way you get from this biblical idea of, in all your ways, know Hashem, in all your ways, everything that you do should be following Torah, to this much more nuanced situation of sometimes the rules are different for different people. And that's not breaking the rules. That's part of the rules.
I guess it starts with, the concept of you should live with them, not that you die by them, right? And that
Them being the commandments.
the mitzvot. And I think one of the things is, in the written Torah, you have the commandments, the mitzvot. The oral Torah is the halacha. It's the implementation of the commandments. So by definition, the written Torah is always static. The oral Torah is dynamic, right? And it flexes. And I think that's the evolution. The evolution by saying that the static situation is there's a commandment that you live by them, not that you die by them, but that they are your guide in life, right? And then you break things down. What is a biblical ordinance? What's a rabbinic ordinance? What's just an extra stringency or an extra safeguard that has been appended, right? I don't know if I'm doing it eloquently or beautifully or if it's making help, but it's the fact that there are certain basic principles that as you pull it through time, I think that was one of the things that one of my teachers said, that he said that the trick isn't to find what it says in the Bible and say, oh, look, this is what we do now, but to say, this is what we do now. And now we're going to show you the provenance of how we can do the genealogy and break it down and lead it all the way back to what we're doing in the Bible. For example, nobody had typewriters back at the time that the Bible was written. Why do we say that typing is one of the things that you're prohibited from doing? Oh, because it's similar to making words and carving letters, but it's not. Then you have to go back into ink and stamping. All of these, it's not being nitpicky to show how you get there, because it's the how you get there that gives you the knowledge and the ability to know where you branch off.
You had said something also that, in particular, the way that that commandment of live by them is interpreted. But you could say, well, if somebody's life is in danger, and interpret life being in danger very narrowly and say, well, yeah, if somebody's like on the verge of death and doing this thing that violates Shabbat or that violates some other commitment will save them, then yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, you've got to strictly adhere to these things. But you brought some sources that said, no, actually, even if there's the shadow of a doubt that something might be dangerous,
Yeah,
right? God forbid you should take any chance of endangering somebody's life. Do what's necessary.
100%. 100%. That is one of the basic principles. And you're right. That's one of the things that Rav Ovadia Yosef, Rav Shlomo, that they always say, you don't play games with people's lives. And one of the things that's becoming more and more acknowledged is that you don't play games with people's mental and spiritual well-being either. And mental health, you don't play games with it. You don't tell somebody, oh, you'll just snap out of it, right? Where do we learn all these things about eating on Yom Kippur?
Mhm.
It's from Tractate of Yoma, and it says, a pregnant woman who smells food, do you let her eat? And the Rav who is teaching us, and he's a dayan, he's a judge, he said, if you notice she smells it, it doesn't say she's hungry. It doesn't say she needs to eat because she's starving. It doesn't say she has a medical condition. It says she smells it. And he said that one of the things that especially the Briskers really pointed out was it's all psychological with that woman, because they have the pregnant woman who smells the food and the ill person who needs to eat. And he brings it up saying that the first one, it's psychological, and you still take it seriously. In the
Mhm.
Gemara, they still take it seriously. They say, you let her eat. You find, right? Same thing
Mhm.
with the ill person. So therefore, like, you don't play games with these things. And it's not just like what's going to happen on Yom Kippur, right?
Mhm.
You don't play games with people's lives.
In my role as a doctor, I've had both Jewish and Muslim patients come to me with sort of the whole spectrum of one coming and say, well, I know it says that I'm allowed to eat, but do I have to eat? And this is somebody who may be an insulin dependent diabetic or some other very obvious situation. Like in those situations, as a physician, I have to say, yes, it's dangerous for you not to eat. If you take your insulin and don't eat, your sugar will drop very, very low and you could die. And if you don't eat and don't take your insulin, your sugar may go very, very, very high and you might die. Either way, you need to eat and you need to take your medicine. Or the very gentle, careful Muslim gentleman who came to me one time, he said, so I heard from my friend who still lives in Baghdad that he went to his imam and they said that if you have certain medical conditions, that there's a ruling that you can give zakat, you can give like the Muslim equivalent of tzedakah, that you can give charity in the amount of whatever you eat, and that excuses you from fasting during the day on Ramadan. And I said, are you asking if it's okay for you to eat? Because you do have a pretty significant heart condition, and I would really prefer that. And it wasn't like a cut and dried, absolutely yes or absolutely no. But like you said, the person kind of tells you what they need to hear. I think it would be an excellent idea for you to give some zakah and eat during Ramadan.
So Rav Yoni Rosenzweig, again, my boss, he told me what he tells people when they have to eat, not like in the situation. And actually, I think that it's tremendous in its simplicity. He says, you are saving a life. How many people on the holiest day of the year say that they are saving a life by you making sure that you eat and take care of your health? You are keeping the chai bahim. He says, this is the kind of thing that most people dream of. May I do something so tremendous? He said, and that's what you're doing. He said that that's how he frames it for people.
Well, that's brilliant. I mean, that's the essence of Yom Kippur, right? Like, who will live and who will die? Well, if you listen to me now, you'll live. Right? You're
Right.
doing that.
Yeah,
This
but
is
it's
what it's
more
all
than that. It's like you're showing, I mean, like, this is what you're doing. You are actively doing one of the biggest mitzvot that
Mhm.
any human being can do, where you're actively saving someone from dying. He said, that's
Mhm.
what you're doing by eating. He said, it's not that,
Brilliant.
oh no, you need to eat. He said, by you doing this
Mhm.
is the highest level of devotion you can show. And there's people who call me year after year after year with
Mhm.
diabetes. And it's actually funny. There's one woman that she calls me and it's a running joke with us. And she says, I know what you're going to tell me. I just really need to hear it. And she's like,
Mm.
I know. She said, but I know that if you don't tell me, I'm not going to be able to do it.
Those of us who are in the doctor's chair often get questions like that as well, whether it's, I want this test because I heard about it. Why can't I have it? Why won't you, order that for me? And happens in the US, happens in Israel, happens in all sorts of countries for different reasons. Either, it's not covered under the universal healthcare plan of that particular country, or your particular insurance company in the US won't cover it, or I don't know how to do that procedure, so I'm not going to do it for you. And your waiting list to get in to see the one doctor in town that does is, a year long. So whatever, but that, or somebody wants a paper sign saying, oh, I get exempted from taking this test in school. And sometimes there's really legitimate reasons to do it. I always tell my students about the 85-15 rule that, 85% of people have some sort of legitimate reason, some more serious than others, but some sort of legitimate reason to be asking you for the thing that they're asking for. And 15% of people may be looking for some sort of secondary gain. But to quote the old story, I would rather, give my money on the street 100 charlatans so one truly deserving beggar gets his money than to leave that one truly deserving beggar go hungry so that I don't get fleeced by somebody else.
Oh, I totally agree. And I'm also going
Yeah.
to say that this situation that I described is an outlier, not even filling all the fingers on one hand. If I have to say, like the situation of a person calling just to rubber stamp is so rare. I would rather tell somebody they can do it and it be my mortal soul than tell somebody no. And it turns
Yes.
out that I caused some incalculable harm. The questions like hers are outliers.
I get the impression that if somebody's calling you, they really want a serious answer, because if they were really trying to get out of something, they would just answer it for themselves most of the time. That's probably fine. Right.
What's sad is that you will get a phone call from somebody who made a decision and then they regret it and they call you and they want you to tell them it was okay. And it's not the rubber stamping, it's the guilt. And sometimes it's not to worry. And sometimes it's let's move on, and you have
Mhm.
to find a way to
Yeah.
say, you did it. It's in the past. We're not looking
Mhm.
backwards. We're looking forwards.
So each of these stories has been a woman called about that. Part of your role, I know you've told me, is that you're talking with women because there are questions that it is easier for them to present to you than in the world that you inhabit, that most of the people that they would ask are men. And when I'm working with my students, I talk a lot about equity and representation and something called concordance, which is the shared commonalities between the doctor and the patient. At least I talked about those things a lot until somebody, position of power in the US, decided those were dirty words, but I still talk
Yeah.
about them. So talk to me about that role that you're inhabiting now, particularly because, again, a lot of just the same people that think of haha as being this very stringent, confining space also think of the space that you're in as being an all male one, which is obviously not true anymore.
No, it really isn't true anymore. There's an enormous amount of women now involved, even in the halachic discourse, that are effecting changes. There's something called Merkaz Eden that was started by a woman who was doing her doctoral degree, looked around at all of the different ritual baths in Israel and was like, I don't like what I'm seeing. And basically, it was a grassroots thing that has really changed. And that was a tangent, but it really
Mhm.
changed the ways you could say it. It was always the men who were
Mhm.
in charge of what was going on in the ritual baths. And this is a group where basically, if you have a problem and there's something there that you don't like, you can turn to them. They will fight the battle for you. more women are getting more involved across all of the spheres, including the ultra religious, because first of all, you're more comfortable going to a woman about a lot of things. It's hard to talk about your body to somebody who doesn't have your body about certain issues. In all fairness, it's really hard to talk about menstrual cramps to a man who's going to sit there and go, oh, yes. Especially when a lot of the halachic questions, by definition, are incredibly invasively personal. I always start with, I apologize for the incredibly invasive nature of this question, but it's not that I say it automatically. It's because I understand that I'm asking them to be in.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I've always considered kind of a real honor of my profession is that people trust me with things that they wouldn't trust anybody with, sometimes even their life partner. I get the same thing in reverse too, where I have a lot of non-English speaking patients and I'll have an interpreter on the phone. The patient will be male, the interpreter will be female, and they'll say, doctor, can you hang up the phone? And I'm like, okay. And in very, very rudimentary English will start to explain to me their below the belt problem because they couldn't share that, even though it's very hard to do it in English,
with a
could
woman.
not share that in their native language with an interpreter that was female.
I totally get that. One time I had a fertility specialist that she said that whenever she sees an ultra religious couple sitting across from her, she always makes a point to thank the husband because she said she knows any yeshiva guy is dying 5 million deaths by a bazillion cuts sitting in a room with his wife and a female fertility specialist. And he's forcing himself to do it because he loves his wife. And she said, so yeah, and I get that. And a lot of women, myself included, we made choices to be extra stringent with ourselves because the idea of turning to a man with any of these questions did a full body. I'm telling you, full body. There were so many times when I was just like, no, I'm not asking. Right. And more and more rabbis are becoming aware that by having more women involved, right, women are being more open-minded and less rigid, and they wind up knowing more. Whereas a rabbi will tell them yes or no, and they're going to be too embarrassed to ask anything else. The woman that they ask, they can say, well, can you explain it to me? So there's a very big change happening. And I think it's because of the fact that there are so many more women involved now.
So I put a pin in something earlier, but really there's pins all over our earlier conversation. I wanted to bring this back around to where my audience is coming from. Most of the people that I've promoted this podcast to are connected to medicine in some way. And certainly in your role, you encounter a lot of medical and mental health professionals. And I'm sensing there's a lot of lessons in what you and I have already talked about and in what else you've experienced that you could teach us some things about how to conduct our business, how to instruct our patients, how we tailor our advice to their unique circumstances.
Well, that I don't know, but I do know, I now remember what one of the 4 was. Cool. That I am not a doctor or a therapist.
So you provide a lot of halachic guidance, a lot of spiritual guidance to the people who consult you for their personal issues.
Right.
I get the sense that there's some guidance, especially on how we communicate our advice, our doctor's orders, that we could really learn from you in handling of similarly delicate situations.
Okay. So I've frequently told you over the years that you are not a doctor, that you're a healer. And in all of the stories that you tell and the stories that you've shared while we've been doing this podcast, you listen, you pay attention, you're keeping the appropriate distance, but you are empathetic. You do have an emotional investment. You know what I mean? By being empathetic means there's an emotional investment, right? You can't say, well, we're completely detached because then, but you do that automatically. I guess for some doctors, I would say that the same way that when people turn to us with certain questions, one of the first things we need to ask is, and what does your doctor say? Right? For example, with birth control, I'm always asked, so what birth control should I take? And I say, that is for your doctor. Yeah, but what
Yeah.
do you think? What do I think? Yes, I think you need to ask your doctor, right?
That's my opinion. You should ask
That's
your
my opinion, right? And then I'll tell
Mhm.
them, listen, if you want to ask me afterwards on the scale, where does your birth control fall halachically? Which, by the way, that's also something, as when I say a scale, because a condom is permitted in very, very, very specific situations, but it's not this massive, absolutely
Right.
never think about it. So I said, then you can call me
And
back and I'll tell you on the scale where it falls.
the medical professionals who are not Jewish and are listening to this, the considerations in Jewish law are very different than, for example, in Catholic religious law, where birth control as a general category of things is generally not permitted. It is permitted in Judaism, just with very different thoughts about which things are preferred in which circumstances, which I think is
Correct.
maybe on the scope of this episode.
Oh, totally. Agreed. Hey, listen, it was a series of 4 lectures for us. So, I mean,
Yeah.
with extra, every year learning other stuff. I would say that the same way that we have to remember that there is frequently a medical component, right? And especially on the hotline, there is always a medical component. A difference between the hotline, I'm going to say, versus you as a doctor when you're sitting across from somebody is a hotline, you have fewer clues to go off of. But when you're sitting opposite a human being and you see their body language and you're talking to them, right? You can sometimes tell, and there's all these other clues, how they're dressed, how they speak to you, and that sometimes these issues, they might not be aware of them, right? There might just be this, oh, I can't, but they can't actually verbalize why. They might need to sit with their religious counselor to figure out why it is that they're having an issue with it, right? But I would say that that might be the place where, like you said, where the man asked the interpreter to get off the phone, where the doctor steps out and lets the religious health professional step in to navigate what's going on so that person can then get the medical treatment that you feel is best for them in a way that they can live with. And chaplaincy doesn't necessarily answer that. And I say that with an enormous amount of respect for chaplaincy, because chaplaincy is so important and so critical, but it doesn't necessarily answer that
Mhm.
particular religious need.
This is going to sound hokey and not mean what people will hear it saying. Some of my best friends are chaplains. But what you do and what they do is different, right?
Yeah.
The catchphrase of chaplaincy is the non-anxious presence. That
Exactly.
sense of accompanying and sitting with the pain, the grief, the suffering. It's not chaplaincy as it's conceived of in the US for sure, and maybe in other countries as well. I don't know it as well in those situations, is really about presence and relief of suffering. It's not about giving somebody practical religious guidance in the way that you're doing. So,
Well, in Hebrew, it actually, the way they describe the two roles is very,
Mhm.
very indicative of the difference. Chaplaincy in Israel is called livui ruchani, which means spiritual accompaniment, right?
Mhm.
Whereas what I do is called tmicha hilchatit, which
Halachic
is,
supports.
yeah. And spiritual accompaniment can be in any way, like you said, but non-anxious, but they're two separate roles.
This has been a tremendously enlightening conversation. I do want to make sure everybody knows where to find you, whether they want to call and ask a question or they want to learn more about the organization. So we will put in the show notes links to Maaglei Nefesh.
And Matan, if they want to see because I wear both hats, because I deal so much with women because of matan. And like you said, the mental health aspect is later. But so I would say matan. And if people have questions and they want to email me, that's more than fine.
Perfect. We will do all of that. All right. Shavua Tov. And
Shabbat.
we'll keep talking.
Yes. And John, thank you again.
I'm sitting at my desk, staring at a piece of art my family got me for Father's Day a few years ago. It's a 3D paper cut with a stethoscope, a clipboard, and a medical chart, and the word doctor in the center. Around the bordering mat, it says, "A good doctor knows medicine. A great doctor knows the patient." There's a story about the Beis Halevi, Rabbi Yosha Ber Soloveitchik, told by his great-granddaughter, Shulamit Soloveitchik Meisel. A man once came to the Beis Halevi to ask if it was permissible to use 4 cups of milk instead of 4 cups of wine to conduct a Passover Seder. Instead of directly answering the question, Rav Yosha Ber asked a series of increasingly probing questions, including whether he'd perhaps been forbidden by his doctor to drink wine. He even offered an elegant solution to that possibility, suggesting the man boil some raisins for the juice instead. No, said the man, he was asking to use milk because he couldn't afford wine. His work as a blacksmith had been very slow that year, and he didn't have the money. Rav Yosha Ber responded by lending the man 25 rubles to buy not just wine, but all the requirements for the Seder, including the meat he couldn't afford either, clearly. Mixing meat and milk at a meal was forbidden. The rabbi understood by the request that this man wasn't planning on eating meat at the Seder either, otherwise he would never have asked to use milk. Miriam's lessons for us remind us very much of this story. It's tempting for knowledgeable people, doctors, rabbis, really anyone who's used to having their advice followed, to answer questions definitively as soon as we're asked. In fact, when we're trading, we're often taught this strategy as the preferred way. It projects confidence to the patient or the questioner, giving us the air of authority. When we're sitting for a licensing exam, our first instinct is supposed to be our best guess. But in patient care, it's rarely that easy. In fact, it's one of the most common kinds of cognitive errors, a mistake called premature closure. Miriam describes the Dalet Amot, or 4 walls of Halacha, the Jewish practice as it's defined by rabbinic law. The 4 walls are supposed to be the structure, the house that we live in. But as anyone who's ever lived in a house knows, we all furnish our houses differently. And depending on what kind of life is being lived in those houses, they can indeed be very different states of tidiness or disarray. The 4 walls may need to be up to code. The rules of everyday life inside those walls, they need to adapt to the people inhabiting. In the medical world, we might compare those Dalet Amot, those 4 walls, to our evidence-based guidelines. Preventive care schedule, the rules for which medication to prescribe for a new diagnosis of diabetes, or the standard care for a specific psychiatric condition. But as our wiser attendings used to teach when I was a resident, patients don't read textbooks. Rav Yosha Ber's blacksmith had a bad year of business. Today, we might call that a social determinant of health. Both his rotten luck with his income and the toxic soot he unlikely inhaled while he was working. Both the Rav's careful questioning to find the true question behind the question and the way I might have approached him if he had come to me in clinic recognize the need to understand not just the question, but the questioner. It's not easy, in medicine or in Jewish law, to exercise this kind of subtle, nuanced approach. Shulamit Soloveitchik Meiselman ends her story by suggesting that her great-grandfather got in trouble with the community elders because they were angry with him for his generosity to someone they had turned away. A doctor who digs too deeply into social determinants of health these days can get in trouble with hospital admin for taking too long with their patients, not keeping up with her volume, or even with the government for using a term, social determinants of health, that, quote, doesn't align with the administration's priority, end quote. Responding to a 4 cups of milk kind of question doesn't just take discernment. It takes courage. I'm sharing Miriam's episode a little later than planned. My 4-week hiatus from the podcast was supposed to have ended when this episode dropped on December 16th. But that morning, my father-in-law, Dr. Natan Nemirovsky, died of melanoma. I'm sharing this episode, Le'ilui Nishmato, for the elevation of his soul. My father-in-law, whom everyone called Nolik, was a psychiatrist in private practice for more than 30 years, and he was notorious, also beloved, for his unhurried visits with his patients, rarely beginning work before noon, frequently spending a solid hour in conversation, often finishing appointments and charting at 11 p.m. or midnight. He frequently described his process to me, hoping to educate this American son-in-law of his, the very naive one, in the ways of medicine the way it used to be. Many times, those conversations took place at his kitchen table after he arrived home from burning that midnight oil and cajoled me in staying up to eat with him. For Nolik, medicine the way it used to be meant as long as the conversations he needed to understand not only the patient, family members who accompanied them, the other medical issues influencing their behavior, and their goals, even the ones he vehemently disagreed with. He wrote small novellas in his charts about each encounter, gathered extensive lab testing when necessary, and regularly burrowed into deep rabbit holes of the medical literature to research what was going on with a person and discover new ways to help them. He was as iconoclastic as Miriam is religious, but he nonetheless approached problems in the same way, flexing the rules without breaking them to provide the care that the patient needed. No one had more courage to speak his mind than Nolik. As his family, I can say we didn't always appreciate that, but as his colleague, I treasure it now. I was blessed to have Nolik as a mentor and as my family through the first 2 decades of my medical career. His loss leaves a void for me and for everyone he cared for or who cared for him. It's some small comfort that after his passing, I'm still surrounded by loved ones, friends, and teachers, including Rabbanit Miriam Fenster, who continue to model that same discretion, deep listening, and individualized approach that I learned from Nolik. May his memory be a blessing to us all. Thanks for spending time with me today. If this conversation sparked something in you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share it with a colleague who could use a reminder of why we do this work. For more thoughts, explore my blog at www.healerswholisten.com/blog, or follow me on Instagram at healerswholisten. For deeper dives, check out the book version of Healing People, Not Patients, or my second book, From Illness to Exodus. Links to both are in the show notes. Our theme song, Room for the Soul, is available on Bandcamp. It's a reminder that together, we can find room for the soul in medicine. This podcast is not medical advice, nor is it legal or financial counsel. It's a space for reflection, rooted in stories, spirituality, and the art of healing. For your own care, always consult the professionals who know you best.